The Fruit Dungeon by Joshua Thomas Foreman. Narrated by J. Aldridge from Solace Audio Studios. George was a fruit farmer, and then in a flash he wasn't. George was bent over planting strawberry seeds when suddenly he was shoved over and intense pain flashed through his body. George caught a last glimpse of his farm before strangely green teeth closed around George's face. George swam through a sea of stars. He was in a place of darkness, his only light thousands of distant pinpricks. "Where am I? What happened?" George shouted, except there was no noise in this place. George felt himself start to be dragged towards one of those points of light. It appeared to be much closer than any other point. George didn't even think to struggle as he was pulled in faster and faster. Then, with a pop, George entered the light, and everything went black. George came back to reality some time later. It was strange. He could see in every direction simultaneously. It seemed like his mind should struggle with the sensation of seeing in every direction, but it didn't. George calmly looked out into the world. His world was rather small, though. It extended only a foot out in every direction. George seemed to be tangled in the roots of some kind of plant. The former farmer couldn't quite see what was growing on the plant to determine what type of plant it was. The plant made him think of something. A quick memory of a farm flashed through his mind. However, quick as it came, the memory left his mind. He could feel his thoughts slowing as he looked at the roots entangling him. Some time later, George had no idea how much, he heard a voice speak into his head.
"Hello, who are you?"
asked the voice. George looked everywhere, but he couldn't see the speaker. It was just this plant. "Who said that?" George asked. The voice laughed.
"It's me. You've tied up in my roots,"
the voice said. George looked appraisingly at the roots. The former farmer couldn't remember a plant ever speaking to him in his what? George couldn't remember. It was like he was reaching for something in his mind that should be there, but just wasn't. It was very frustrating. Well, I'm George," he offered. Watching closely this time, he saw a pulse of blue energy travel down the roots to touch him as the plant spoke.
"I'm Blue. When you were born, I was gifted by somebody, maybe the gods, with certain knowledge about what you are and how to help you,"
Blue revealed. George considered this. He did want some answers. For some reason, he felt like he should be off doing something else. "What am I?" George asked. Once again, George watched the blue energy travel down the roots.
"You're a dungeon, of course,"
Blue declared. George didn't really understand. He felt like he should, though. That word, dungeon, tickled something in the back of his mind. "What does that mean?" George questioned. Blue laughed again.
"It means that you can do a lot of different things. You can do anything from making items or traps to making monsters or growing plants,"
Blue explained. George's mind latched onto the last point. Growing plants. Yes, that was right. George wanted to grow plants. "Well, how can I grow plants?" George asked, becoming excited. Blue hummed as she considered.
It's a bit more complicated than that. First, you need to spread your influence to the area in which you want to grow plants. Then you will need to gather seeds or other parts of the plant you want to grow, and then you can sow them to cultivate the plants,"
Blue explained. George didn't love all the steps involved. He just wanted to grow his plants and live a quiet life. He would do what it took to attain it, though. "How do I spread my influence?" George asked. Blue laughed as she began to explain. It turns out spreading his influence is much more complicated than George had hoped. The main issue is George needed to accumulate a certain level of mana. Mana was the energy of the universe. It is what allowed beings like Blue to exist. Blue wasn't a normal plant. She had been a regular blueberry bush before the gods or whoever gifted her the knowledge she needed to train George. Now she was something else, and neither of them really knew what. However, without mana, Blue would wither and die. To gain mana, George either needed to absorb materials from his surroundings, or better, slay living creatures and absorb their mana. For now, George was happily eating downward through the dirt. After George had a certain threshold of mana, he would feel a pressure. It would be as though he had eaten a large meal. George didn't understand what Blue meant by that, but when he reached that threshold, he definitely felt full. From that point, George needed to push his mana out of his body in a sort of mist. Wherever the mist touched, he felt his awareness slip into the dirt. The mist could move through the soil and dirt. Slowly, over multiple days, the former farmer took control of a 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot cube of dirt. George was hoping this room could be the beginning of his plant-growing operation. George was finishing up clearing the last of the dirt in his room when Blue spoke. She had remained silent for several days while he took control and absorbed all the dirt in his room.
That looks really good, except we need to figure out a good way down there. You can't remain outside of your dungeon, and I am a rather large target up here,
Blue said. George and Blue were currently a foot away from one of the room's walls. They rested near the ceiling, which George hadn't absorbed yet, but would need to eventually if he wanted to grow his plants. George had an idea. He was able to easily manipulate the dirt his influence had touched. If George took over all the area around Blue, he should be able to move them both to the room with relative ease. George swiftly flared his mana out in a mist and took control of a 3-foot circle around Blue and himself. From there, George slowly controlled their movement. They slid down until they were level with the floor. Before George moved them into the room itself, he realized they had a problem. Blue couldn't just rest on the ground like George could. However, George was very tangled in her roots, and George didn't really see a good way to leave the roots. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to either. If he left the roots, he might not be able to speak with Blue. George needed some kind of pot that Blue and he could rest in. The pot would also be much easier to move as he expanded. "Blue, how can I make things?" George asked.
Oh, well, if you've absorbed a material, you can use your mana to form it into pretty much whatever shape you want. You can also use your mana to create more of a substance that you've actually absorbed,
Blue explained. George thought back to all the materials he had absorbed over the last few days. There had been several rocks, bones, and a few metals mixed in with the dirt. George went for a stone pot with a copper inlay to make it look suitably impressive. The pot sprung into being in the room, and it cost surprisingly little of George's mana. George continued their progress and dropped themselves into a large pot waiting for their arrival.
"Well, this looks very nice,"
Blue complimented, examining the pot. George felt a bit of pride fill his gem. George looked around his room. Blue and he were located against the center of the eastern wall. The walls were made of dirt, similar to the floor and ceiling. Several roots poked through the ceiling into the next room. "So, what's next?" George asked. He was very excited to start growing his plants.
"Well, now that you have a room, you need to select a monster type,"
Blue advised. She was going to keep going, but George interrupted her. "Plant monsters. No, wait. Fruit monsters," George envisioned. He didn't know why, but fruit monsters just seemed right. Blue ruffled some of her leaves in irritation at being interrupted.
"All right. If you want fruit monsters, we are going to need to find some fruit seeds. It's possible those plants up there are fruits. I'd build a barrier above us and then collapse the ceiling," Blue said.
George quickly did as she suggested. A stone box rose up around the plant, completely closing the pair in. Sealed in, George absorbed the edges of the ceiling. The interior fell down into the room with a loud thud. Dirt sprayed everywhere, and the plants were destroyed. George quickly grew a new ceiling. Blue had mentioned being a target several times now, and he wanted to be sure they weren't attacked. Once the ceiling was in place, George quickly absorbed the debris from the collapse, along with the stone box. George was thrilled with what he found. There were a dozen fruit bushes that fell into the room. 6 were strawberry bushes, and 6 were blueberry bushes. "We have fruit!" George shouted in excitement. Blue laughed at George's enthusiasm for fruit.
"It's pretty simple now. You just need to make a seed and pump it full of mana to make your first fruit monster,"
Blue explained. George considered and decided to go with strawberries first. They had always been one of his favorites. George paused. When had they been one of his favorites? For a second, it was almost as if George had remembered something, but it was gone now. Frustration filled him at the loss of memory. George did his best to push the memory away as he summoned a strawberry seed. George focused on the seed and began to funnel mana into it. The seed began to grow rapidly. Roots spread as greenery sprouted above the dirt. It quickly grew into a full bush. Soon after, flowers appeared along the bush. Those swiftly changed into ruby-red strawberries. From there, things became different. One of the strawberries detached from the bush. The bush quickly withered and died, but the lone strawberry grew significantly in size. A pair of legs shot out from the bottom of the strawberry. They appeared to be made of woven roots. A similar pair of arms burst from the sides of the berry a moment later. A seam formed in the middle of the berry's body, and George could see teeth that looked a lot like thorns lacing the interior. With that, the mana cut off, and the strawberry monster stood still. It was a strange monster. It stood 3.5 feet tall, and it had wickedly sharp claws on the end of each arm. The leaves on the top of its head had grown and almost looked like hair.
Well, it's certainly interesting looking, Blue offered.
George tried to order it to move, however it completely ignored him and focused on Blue. Blue? George asked nervously as the strawberry beast took a step towards the pair.
Oh, I forgot. You need to kill the monster the first time you make it. You made the strawberry, but you didn't exactly make the monster. This was a natural evolution just accelerated by your mana, Blue said in a rush. George quickly looked for a way to kill this creature, but he couldn't think of anything. He could collapse the ceiling again, but putting up the stone box may take too long. George's resolve was firm. He would need to try. George's mana flared as the strawberry monster took several more steps in the pair's direction. George quickly started forming the stone box. He started with the walls facing the strawberry monster. If it couldn't get to them, then George could take his time. The walls went up just as the strawberry monster reached them. It hammered on the stone wall, and George could see small cracks starting to form in the stone after a few seconds of pounding. It clearly packed a much bigger punch than George realized. Hurry!
Blue shouted, starting to panic.
I'm trying,
George affirmed as he managed to form the roof of the box. Finally, as a large series of cracks spiderwebbed across one of the walls, George dropped the ceiling. The ceiling rained down onto the strawberry monster and crushed it. Red juice went spouting in every direction, and George felt nothing but relief. George quickly absorbed the strawberry monster's body and the fallen ceiling. The former farmer once again rebuilt the ceiling and decided it was best to keep the stone box up for now.
We got it,
George bragged. He couldn't believe how close his own creation had come to destroying him.
We sure did. Now, you should be able to make them without that happening.
Blue updated him. George summoned his mana, and he found the amount had dropped significantly. He hadn't realized how much mana he had pumped into the strawberry monster. Pretty soon, George would need to spend a bunch of time just absorbing his surroundings to refill it. For now, though, George summoned the strawberry monster. When he absorbed the creature's body, a pattern had formed in his mind. George now just had to channel mana into this pattern, and a few seconds later, a strawberry monster almost identical to the previous one took form. George ordered it to move around and was pleased that it listened almost instantly. The strawberry monster wasn't particularly fast. However, it was able to deliver a significant amount of strength with its clawed hands. Overall, George was pleased with the monster. He wanted to make more of the strawberry monsters and maybe just grow some normal strawberries. George didn't know why, but he felt a strong urge to plant normal fruits along with the monsters. George could already tell he would need more space, which he mentioned to Blue. He was frustrated that even though he had gone through the hoops of getting this room, he still couldn't just grow plants.
We do. Most dungeons begin with 3 rooms connected by a pair of tunnels. That's usually enough space until the dungeon wants a second floor, and then they usually expand the first floor at the same time, Blue explained. George saw no reason not to go with the 3-room design. He didn't see the need for anything fancy. George quickly made a few more strawberry monsters to guard him and began working on the expansions to the dungeon. It took 2 weeks to finish the dungeon expansions, 3 rooms connected by a pair of tunnels. The first room George created had ended up becoming the final room in the line of 3. The pair of tunnels had also been given slight curves so the contents of each room couldn't be seen until actually entering the room. Moreover, he built a tunnel on an upward angle from the first room, ending at the ground level.
It was still blocked, though. George needed to fill his dungeons with monsters before he could open the entrance. George was nearly bursting with mana after digging out the tunnels and rooms. The next step was to see what the blueberry bush monster would look like. George created a blueberry bush seed in his final room. Before he funneled mana into the seed, George ensured his strawberry monsters would be ready. 6 of the creatures stood in a circle around the seed. Seeing the beasts were ready, the former farmer began sending his mana into the seed. Roots shot into the earth as the starts of the bush began to form. Soon a full bush covered in blueberries sat in the room. However, instead of a blueberry detaching, the bush itself grew in size, doubling in size, until it was nearly the size of one of the strawberry creatures. Next, 2 long, vine-like appendages stretched out from the main body. At the end of each appendage sat an absolutely massive blueberry. They were each the size of cantaloupes. The texture of their outer surface had taken on something similar to a cantaloupe rind as well. It was hard and rough compared to the soft and smooth texture blueberries usually had. George didn't know what to think of the creature. Before George could react, the appendages of the new blueberry monster lashed out at 2 of the strawberry monsters. To George's surprise, the appendages moved much faster than seemed possible with the heavy-looking berries on the end of its arms. Each appendage slammed into a strawberry monster. The blueberries at the end of each appendage hammered into the center of each strawberry beast, causing a fountain of red juice to spray from the dead creatures' bodies. While the bush monster was busy, the 4 remaining strawberry monsters attacked. Their claws ripped into the main body of the creature, tearing leaf, twig, and berries apart. Before the bush monster could be killed, the mass of blueberries whirled around and smashed apart another pair of the strawberry monsters. George was beginning to grow concerned that he might need to collapse the roof after all. However, one of the strawberries clenched its jaws around a huge part of the bush monster. With a vicious twist, the section of the bush monster pulled free with a geyser of blue liquid. The bush monster collapsed, dead. Stunned that this one monster was able to destroy 4 of his strawberry monsters, George was excited that it could become his primary monster type. The strawberry beasts were certainly impressive, but the level of destruction this bush monster could dish out was on a different level. However, when George checked the mana cost to create the monster and found it was nearly 4 times as much, his hopes were dashed. As it stood, George only had the mana to make 3 or 4 more of the stronger creatures, while the same amount of mana could make around 15 strawberry monsters.
That creature is certainly rather impressive. We should name it. We should name the strawberries as well, now that I think of it,
Blue said excitedly. George hadn't thought to name his monsters. It made sense. Strawberry monster was a bit of a mouthful. Do you have any ideas? George asked as he started summoning one of the blueberry bush monsters. Blue was silent as the bush monster came into being.
I think berry ball for the blueberry monster and berry beast for the strawberry monsters,
Blue offered. With no better ideas, the dungeon agreed easily. The question is, how do we break the berry balls and the berry beasts up between the 3 rooms? George wondered. George definitely wanted one of the berry balls in his own room. It seemed to offer the most protection at the moment.
Actually, the real question is which of these guys you want to turn into your first boss creature,
Blue corrected him. This was the first time George was hearing about a boss creature. However, it was like before, when Blue had told him that he was a dungeon. George felt like it was something he should know, but the memory just wasn't there. So, he asked what it was.
Basically, you can select a single monster and elevate it to a higher version of itself. The results of the boss monster transformations are usually pretty random, but every boss monster is unique. It is even possible that in time, your regular monster can become a boss monster within your dungeon,
Blue explained. George had seen the berry ball fight and win in its current form. Would it make sense to go all in on the berry ball, or to try and elevate a berry beast to make it more effective? George ordered the berry ball to move around as he considered. The monster was very slow moving anywhere. It needed to drag itself across the floor with its appendages. While those were fast, they weren't ideally shaped for this, causing progress to be slow. It was a bit of a balancing act then. Would George rather have a slow offensive machine, or a monster that had more speed with fewer offensive abilities? Am I locked into this decision, or can I change my boss later? George asked.
Well, of course you can. You can always discard a boss monster for a new one. In fact, as you get stronger, you're going to have to, Blue responded.
That decided it then. George would use one of his berry balls for his boss. If it didn't work out, then he would just switch to one of his berry beasts. What do I do to make this happen? George asked, excitement clearly lacing his words. Blue laughed at George's enthusiasm.
It's the same as making the monster. You just need to pour mana into it. You won't need to kill the monster once it's made, though, since it will be your boss. If you are trying for a natural evolution, then you would need to slay the new monster, Blue explained.
George indicated he understood and focused on the berry ball. Mana flowed from George into the creature, and nothing happened. Nothing continued to happen until the mana flow cut off. Finally, the berry ball's main body grew slightly. The biggest change was in the 4 additional appendages that shot out from the bush. Each was also topped with one of the massive blueberries. The berries themselves had also changed. On each berry, several small, blunt protrusions had formed. It made them look like blunted mace balls. George ordered the beast to move. The new dungeon was surprised when, instead of dragging itself across the floor like it had before, the beast shot all 6 appendages down and connected them with the ground. The body then lifted, and the creature began to walk like a spider. It was a bit faster than before, but still much slower than the berry beasts. However, the appendages were still very fast. Overall, George was pleased with the creature's new form.
What are you going to name it?
Blue asked excitedly. George was confused. Hadn't they just named these creatures berry balls? What do you mean? George asked. Blue ruffled her leaves in annoyance.
It's a boss monster. Boss monsters gain specific names. They're usually also 2 parts, so something like George the Destroyer or something, Blue explained.
George stared at the beast slowly walking around the boss room. What would be a good name? George realized he wasn't going to be adept at this, and maybe Blue would want to name the creature. After all, she was the one who kept bringing this up. Would you like to name it? George asked. Blue fell silent for a long minute.
Yes, of course I would,
Blue shouted. George hadn't realized that Blue could speak so loudly into his mind. What will it be, then? George prodded.
How about Paul the Pummeler?
Blue suggested. George wasn't exactly in love with the name, but Blue seemed excited about it. And if it would make her happy, then it wasn't worth arguing about it. Even if George thought it would be more amusing if it were a plum monster called the Plummeler. Sounds good. Paul the Pummeler it is, George agreed. Now he had to decide how to distribute his monsters. Paul would obviously remain in the boss room. From there, the new dungeon would create either 2 berry balls or 10 berry beasts. George's mana supply had dipped significantly after creating Paul. The only real combination George could make was 1 berry ball and 5 berry beasts. That should work, he thought. He quickly summoned the monsters in the boss room. He still wasn't quite sure how to distribute them.
Traditionally, the fights should get harder the deeper into the dungeon somebody goes,
Blue offered. That meant his berry ball would be going in the second room. George felt like 5 berry beasts might be a bit too much for the first room, so he split the group of them. 2 joined the berry ball in the second room, while the remaining 3 headed to the first room. If nothing else, hopefully the design would prevent enemies from just picking off the berry ball from range. There was only one step remaining. George needed to create an entrance. George's entrance was simple. A trio of massive stone strawberries rose up from the ground in a triangle formation. They connected together at the top, which created a large opening at the bottom due to the curve of the strawberries. At the point where the strawberries met stood a stone version of a berry ball. George was rather pleased with the design. It was rather simple, yet it would still give a warning to anyone who entered that this was a dungeon.
So, what now?
Blue asked. George laughed. Isn't that supposed to be my question? He ribbed her. Blue let out a light chuckle.
You're all set up. There's really nothing to do until something stumbles into this place,
Blue explained. Not quite. Now I get to grow my fruit. That's why I did all of this. I want to grow my plants and protect them with these monsters, George explained.
Oh,
Blue said simply before falling silent. George flexed his mana, ready to cultivate his floral friends. To his lament, before he could, only a few minutes after the entrance was built, several things stepped into the dungeon. There were 6 of the creatures, 3 white, 3 green, all with rather similar body shapes. About 4 feet tall, they had bodies similar to George's berry beast. Legs shot down and arms tipped with claws hung from each side of the bodies. A slit lined with thorn-like teeth split their bodies. The difference came in their colors and their heads. The green creatures had rather fluffy-looking heads, while the white ones had a round, smooth head. They were rather odd-looking. Strangely, George instantly felt an intense hatred for these creatures, and he could not explain why. "What are those things?" George asked, anger in his voice. Blue stuttered for a second until she finally got her thoughts in order.
They seem to be some kind of mushroom monster and broccoli monster,
Blue appraised. The creatures were moving down the ramp to the first room. George realized the creatures must have somehow sensed he was down here. There was no other way they could be ready to enter the dungeon almost as soon as it opened. "How did they know we were here?" George asked. Blue hummed in consideration as the beast entered the first room.
Perhaps they were in the area when we collapsed the ceiling? It did make a good bit of noise,"
Blue offered. George wasn't so sure about the explanation, but he didn't have any better ideas. George had little faith that his berry beasts could win when outnumbered 2-1. The invaders stood in 2 lines, the broccoli monsters in front and the mushroom monsters in back. The broccoli monsters were slightly bigger, so this tactic made some sense. George quickly ordered his berry beasts to attack. The berry beast appeared to be slightly faster than the broccoli monsters. The trio of George's monsters slashed, bit, and tore at the broccoli beast, who took a beating. George thought the fight might actually be over right there. His hopes were crushed as a cloud of yellow spores shot out from the mushroom monsters. The spores were drawn to the berry beast, who couldn't help but breathe the spores in. A few short moments later, the berry beast lay unmoving in the dirt. While the invaders had won this round, their victory was not without losses. All 3 of the broccoli monsters were heavily injured. George knew a solid hit from his berry ball in the next room would be more than enough to vanquish any of the broccoli monsters. George wasn't even sure if his berry ball would be affected by the mushroom monster's spore attack. The group of invaders continued deeper into the dungeon. They arrived at the second room quickly. George was kicking himself for not installing some kind of trap. The group of monsters were just walking unconcernedly down the tunnel. He needed to focus on the next fight. George maneuvered his berry beasts in the next room to either side of the doorway, hoping to launch a surprise attack on the group. The invaders entered the second room a few moments after George's critters got into position. The second the trio of injured broccoli monsters entered the room, the berry beasts struck. Claws and teeth tore into the 2 outer broccoli monsters. These attacks exacerbated the previous injuries, causing the broccoli monsters to fall quickly. Before the pair of berry beasts could turn to attack the remaining broccoli monster, spores spread from the mushroom monsters. Just like in the previous room, the berry beasts soon lay dead on the floor. But this time, that didn't end the fight. It appeared George had been right in guessing that the berry ball wouldn't be affected by the spores. As the spores settled onto the ground, the berry ball came into range of the last broccoli monster. Both large blueberry balls hurtled into the remaining broccoli beast and sent it back into one of the mushroom monsters. The pair tumbled to the ground. However, George was certain the broccoli beast wouldn't be getting back up. The remaining mushroom monsters did something George hadn't expected. They split to either side of the berry ball, narrowly avoiding its flailing arms. To George's absolute shock, the fungal invaders just ran away out of the room and down the tunnel. While they weren't very fast, they still moved fairly quickly. George hurried to order Paul right in front of the entrance to the boss room. There would be no running away this time. Meanwhile, he also ordered the berry ball in the second room to pursue the fleeing invaders. George intended to ensure these creatures did not escape. The mushroom monsters rounded the edge of the tunnel's curve and froze when they saw Paul in their path. 3 of Paul's arms lanced out, attempting to strike down the monsters, but he wasn't quite close enough. The pair of monsters backed up a few steps before turning to run. George let out a light chuckle. There would be no escape. When the mushroom monsters reached the other end of the tunnel and found the other berry ball already in the doorway, they turned back around and started down the tunnel again. George hadn't ordered Paul to move into the tunnel. While the tunnel wasn't small, it wasn't exactly large either. Paul would be at a significant disadvantage in the tunnel. It also didn't seem to be necessary, as the berry ball would corral them towards Paul. The invading beasts continued to run back and forth rather stupidly. George had no idea what they hoped to accomplish. However, when the berry ball had nearly closed the gap, and the mushrooms were just out of range of both monsters, they froze. A tendril of mana shot out from one of the mushroom monsters. The tendril of mana connected with one of the walls and traveled to George's core. The former farmer wasn't sure what this was, so he stopped the berry ball's pursuit of the mushroom monsters. When the tendril of mana connected with George's core, he heard a voice speak in his mind. It wasn't Blue. This voice sounded masculine. "Hello, George. This is Rick. I'm sure you remember me. If you are receiving this message, it means my creatures were defeated. I will return for you, George. And the next time, I won't bring 6 pitiful monsters. I'll bring an army. Enjoy this victory, because soon I will destroy you." Rick spoke in a deep, ominous voice. The message was very concerning, and George quickly gave the order to his beasts to slay the mushroom monsters. They quickly cut the invaders down, but George was distracted. Rick was a name that he felt like he should know. That name and that voice sounded so familiar. To feel so deeply that he should remember, yet be unable to, felt infuriating.
"George, are you okay?"
Blue inquired, concern in her voice. George shook himself out of his thoughts. Yeah. Did you hear that?" George asked.
"No. Hear what?"
Blue asked. George quickly told Blue what the message had said.
"That's really concerning. We need to get to work on expanding further. We should try and push for a second floor, as well as the first floor expansion as soon as we can," Blue said, worried. George felt the same way. For each floor he built, there would be a boss. Having a second boss would be a game changer in a war with Rick. George wasn't exactly sure what else he could do, though. It would take time to get the mana needed to spread his influence that far. There was no way Rick wouldn't act in that time. "Do you know any way I can get the mana needed to make that happen?" George pleaded. If anyone had a solution, it would be Blue. She hummed, considering. Well, for one, you should absorb the bodies of the dead monsters. That will bring back all the mana you spent to create them, and the mana of Rick's monsters,"
Blue explained. George quickly did as she recommended. He then used the mana from his monsters to create the 5 berry beasts again. They appeared in the rooms they were assigned to instead of the boss room. George also ordered the berry ball to return to the second room. The mana George received was slightly more than George would use to create 6 berry beasts. This meant that Rick's monsters were likely slightly more powerful than George's if they cost more mana. Still, it was definitely a good start, and it would allow George to take control of another room or two. The issue was then going to be filling those rooms with monsters. George also wanted to assemble some traps. "There's too much to do. We have no way of knowing when Rick will strike," George complained. Blue laughed.
"Well, why don't you just send out a scout? One of the berry beasts could stand outside and let us know if it sees anything. You can also see through their eyes when they're outside the dungeon."
Rick wasn't sure about this idea. If he had received only the mana from Rick's monsters, that likely meant that the mana from monsters killed outside of the dungeon wouldn't return to him. Still, George wasn't sure he had an option. The new dungeon sent some of the mana through the pattern for a berry beast. He would send one out to scout, but not at the cost of his own forces. The berry beast came into existence in the first room and quickly scurried out of the dungeon. George was startled by what he saw through the monster's eyes. Fields of growing fruit. George saw whole fields of strawberries and blueberry bushes, with the boss room situated right at the division between them. Even more pleasantly surprised, the former farmer found that there was a patch of watermelons and a patch of blackberries. There also appeared to be a small orchard, but George couldn't see what was growing on the trees. The prospect of gaining at least 2, but likely 3 new monster types was exciting. However, when the berry beast turned around, George was stunned. There was a small house. It was wooden with red paint. A mailbox sat in front of it with the word George painted on the side. George realized that this must have been his house. However, he could not remember anything about the structure, nor when he had even owned the house. Feeling a need to examine this further, the former tenant sent his scout. It was possible the house could give George answers he had been searching for. When the berry beast reached the front of the house, George found the door was half open. The berry beast walked through and found the house had been ransacked. Long gouges had been made in the walls and floor. The couch was shredded, items had been broken and tossed on the floor, and blood had been sprayed across the room. George didn't know what to think. He knew on a deep level that Rick had done this. The berry beast continued deeper into the small house. The kitchen was in a similar state as the last room. The door to the bedroom had been splintered. Somebody must have locked it, and Rick's monsters had needed to go through the door. Inside, George had found the body of a woman. She had been brutally mauled. Large chunks of her had been ripped away. It was a gruesome sight. Something happened within George at the sight of this woman. Originally, he felt anger and a bit of pity. However, when the berry beast's gaze landed on the woman's face, something snapped within George. Memories flooded his mind of his past life. George remembered his farm, his house, and his wife. This woman had been George's wife, Greta. Rage like nothing George had ever felt coursed through his gem-like body. Rick had done this. George remembered Rick now. He ran a neighboring vegetable farm. They had argued for years about anything and everything until finally George had met Greta. Rick had wanted to marry Greta, but Greta had married George, and Rick never forgave George for that. George's anger began to cool until it was like a sheet of ice. George had things he needed to do, but first George would bury his wife's body. George buried Greta in the blackberry field. He now remembered that those had been her favorite. He had expanded the mana to take control of the area around where she was buried. George intended to keep a close eye on the location and would not let anyone disturb her. The goals now were to figure out a way to fight off Rick's incoming army and then to destroy Rick. George suspected that he might not actually be able to accomplish the latter goal for some time. It would take a while for George to feel comfortable sending out a large enough force to fully clear a rival dungeon. It would likely take several dozen monsters. George needed to focus on growing his own power base for now. With that goal in mind, George had his berry beast grab a watermelon, a blackberry, and what he had come to remember would be an apple from the orchard. These would hopefully make strong addition to George's forces. George had high hopes for the watermelon. It was a much larger fruit than he had previously worked with, and he had hoped he could render it into some kind of defensive monster. George was waiting patiently for his fruits to be delivered when Blue spoke.
George, I'm sorry about your wife. I had no idea.
Sadness clearly tinted her words. George felt a familiar sadness. He did his best to bury it under the layer of icy anger. It's okay, Blue. It's not your fault. We'll get stronger and defeat Rick, just like you said, George offered, trying to comfort her. She fell silent for several long minutes, and the berry beast had even returned with the fruits. George was beginning to think she wasn't going to respond when she spoke.
I'm not sure if this is something you'd be willing to do, but there are a lot of different plants up there. If the berry beast brought you all of them, it's possible you would gain the mana you needed to expand to a second floor. Living things offer much more mana than dirt, after all, Blue said tentatively.
George really didn't like the idea of destroying his farm, their farm. He and his wife had put their lives into this land, and it seemed wrong to destroy those plants. The former farmer consoled himself that he could always grow new plants after Rick was destroyed. It enlivened George, the idea of improving the farm. He would be able to grow the plants more expertly as well, with his knowledge of soil composition he had gained from his brief time as a dungeon. I don't love it, but it's likely the only way we can win, George conceded, his resolve hardening. Before ordering the berry beasts to start bringing him all the plants, George created 2 more berry beasts to help, which subsumed nearly all of George's remaining mana. George was hoping the extra hands would allow him to take down some of the trees. He had a suspicion that they would offer more mana than the bushes. The trio of monsters left while George absorbed the plants the first piece had brought him. George decided to start by forming the blackberry monster first. He figured it had the smallest chance of going horribly wrong when it was summoned. George had Paul and 3 of the berry beasts in the room as he began pumping mana into the seed. It went through a process nearly identical to that of the strawberry. A bush with ripe blackberries grew, and a single berry detached. However, that is where the process diverged. The berry grew larger until it was a perfect sphere. The outer part of the blackberry had turned into some kind of weird hexagonal-shaped plates. 4 stubby legs shot from the bottom of the creature, and 4 tubes protruded from each side. It was a rather strange-looking creature. Before these monsters could attack, 4 streams of a purple-black liquid fired from the tubes. The liquid connected with Paul and 2 of the berry beasts. It appeared to be some kind of potent acid, as the berry beasts were destroyed very quickly, along with several of Paul's twigs, leaves, and berries were destroyed. It seemed like Paul was able to take the hit much better than the berry beasts, at least. George wondered if it had to do with the pummeler being a higher-ranked monster. Paul struck at the sphere. To George's surprise, it was able to hold up to 3 solid blows from the pummeler. However, once the 4th ball connected, the monster collapsed in on itself. Purple-black liquid spilled out from the body, completely coating the last berry beast and Paul.
Well, that was certainly something,
Lou commented. George wasn't sure how useful this monster would be if its acid had to be spilled every time it died. Sure, it would be okay by itself, but George hadn't seen the creature move once. George wasn't sure it actually could move. If it couldn't move, then it might be best to not use this monster. Well, I guess I just hope the apple and watermelon provide better results, George espoused. Blue didn't respond as George absorbed the bodies into acid. He quickly summoned Paul and the 3 berry beasts. To George's surprise, his new blackberry monster actually had a rather cheap mana cost. It only cost half as much as one of the berry beasts. George decided that, with a price like that, he would need to find a use for them. George created the Appleseed next, making it was significantly different from any of the previous monsters. Roots appeared and a tree trunk shot up 6 feet. Then branches shot out from the trunk randomly. It was just a sapling. However, instead of growing into a full tree like George had expected, the tree stopped when it was 6 feet tall. The bottom of the tree's trunk split vertically from the ground to the halfway point. It lifted each leg up and pulled the roots from the ground. After that, a pair of thin arms shot out from each side of the sapling's body. The ends of the arms were strange. Instead of hands, they were more like the ends of spoons. Quickly, the new dungeon learned why. As the arms began to rapidly smack apples hanging in its branches, the spoons launched the apples at George's monsters. They impacted with surprising force. One of the berry beasts was killed quickly, and a second had come under attack. That was the end of the creature's fun, though, as a ball from Paul crushed the monster. George didn't really know what to think about the apple-throwing tree. It didn't really do that much damage, but it was his only real ranged fighter. The blackberry monster might count, but its range didn't seem to be very far, and it couldn't move. At least the tree could move. George checked the mana cost and found it to be about the cost of 2 berry beasts. While this version of the monster wasn't quite as effective as he might wish, George could envision a hulking tree launching boulder-sized apples. This monster definitely had potential. It was time for the watermelon seed, and George had brought in all 5 berry beasts and his lone berry ball, along with Paul the Pummeler, to handle this beast. George checked that his monsters were all in position, and he started funneling mana into the seed. It grew into a full watermelon patch quickly. Once it reached normal sizes, something strange happened. Instead of 1 watermelon detaching, all 5 watermelons on the plant detached. The largest became the creature's torso. One of the remaining watermelons split into quarters, and another into halves. 2 quarters went to either side of the torso to form an arm. Each half then connected to the ends of the arms. The same thing happened with the 2 remaining watermelons to form legs. Finally, at the top of the torso, a green 9-inch long spike formed. When it dropped to the ground, it fell to all 4s. George had expected it to walk upright like his berry beasts, but this would work too. The watermelon charged with surprising speed at one of the berry beasts. Its horn pierced the monster, red juice spraying everywhere. Without slowing, the monster made a loop and was charging at another berry beast. George ordered it to dodge. The monster was too late, though. Before it could move, the watermelon monster had trampled it with its large feet. The watermelon monster jerked to its side, and the berry beast impaled on its horn sailed away. The creature never stopped its charge. George realized his blackberry monsters would be excellent for stopping a monster like this. He didn't need to worry, though, as Paul finally came in range of the creature. All 6 blueberry balls slammed into the watermelon monster, completely caving in the beast's torso. George absorbed the bodies from the fight and ordered his remaining troops back to their rooms. George rather liked the watermelon monster. He especially liked the potential for it to act as a mount for one of his other monsters. If his berry beasts could ride these creatures and build up enough momentum, they could be unstoppable. However, George needed the space in the dungeon to make such a creature useful. George looked at the stockpile of plants the 3 berry beasts had brought while he had been busy and was shocked by its quantity. A full 4 trees and a large pile of bushes sat in the tunnel's entrance. George absorbed one of the trees, and to his delight, it filled nearly a quarter of his mana reserves. George quickly absorbed the rest of the materials. With that feeling of being full, George got down to work expanding the dungeon. A full month had passed since George had received Rick's message. George was hurriedly making his final preparations for the army that was fast approaching his entrance. The large group of what he estimated to be around 100 monsters had been spotted nearly 3 hours ago and was fast approaching. George had expanded the first floor to contain a full 8 rooms, and work on the second floor had started. It wasn't finished yet, but it was more a series of long tunnels leading to a final room. George had moved himself and Blue to this final room, and they were now discussing what their second floor boss monster should be.
I vote either defenders or cats for the boss, Blue said.
Defenders were what they had named the stationary blackberry units, and cats were the apple tree monster. The watermelon monster had been named Waterhorse. George was more in favor of going with one of the mount units. He had ended up moving forward with his idea. However, when he ordered the berry beasts to climb on top of the mounts, they had actually become their own monster type. This combination had been named Mount Units by George and Blue. The second floor featured a large number of mount units, cats, and defenders, so George definitely wanted to stick with one of these 3.
If we go with the mount units, it's really like we are getting 2 bosses, George argued.
This wasn't the first time he had made that argument, but Blue wasn't having any of it. This argument had been going on for the last 2 hours, and they needed to decide within the next 30 minutes, or it would be too late.
The issue is that this room doesn't suit how that monster fights. The long hallways are better for them, because they can build up speed. The defender monster is probably best for this room, and we could even make the cats work if we manipulate the terrain. However, we won't be able to make this room work for the mounts unless we add more space, which we can't do, Blue said. George knew she was right, and he was sick of arguing with her. If he had to pick between these 2 monsters, he would choose the cats. They at least had guaranteed movement. All right, we'll go with the cats, George said, exasperated.
Blue fell silent, eager to see what the new boss would look like. George quickly created one of the cats. From there, he started funneling the remainder of his mana into the creature. Just like with Paul, nothing happened until the mana cut off. However, when it did, George wasn't exactly ready for the results. The tree grew from 6 feet tall to 10 feet tall. The trunk grew significantly thicker, and its branches both lengthened and thickened. However, the most interesting part was the apples hanging from its branches now had different colors. There were red, yellow, and blue apples. They were also slightly larger than before, and the catapult hands had become more like a normal human hand as well. George was honestly just thankful he had made this room significantly larger than the first floor boss room, into which the creature would barely fit.
What are we going to name it? Can I name this one too? Blue asked.
George began making the alterations to the room. Sure, that works, George said. George was growing nervous about the incoming army. They had seen several monster types in it. What concerned George the most was a mount unit that had mysteriously gone missing. The creature hadn't even seen what had attacked it. The changes to the room were made quickly. As they finished, Blue had an answer for him.
How about Chuck the Chucker? Blue offered.
Similar to when she had named Paul, George really didn't have a preference. Sounds good, George said, and as he did, the first of the invading monsters entered the dungeon. The army consisted mostly of broccoli monsters. They were clearly Rick's version of a berry beast. Their army also contained a sizable number of the mushroom monsters who now rode mounts. The mounts looked a lot like an extremely large carrot with legs. The last group of monsters was a 6-foot-tall beast composed entirely of lettuce. There were only 5 of those, though, which led George to believe they were expensive to create. Rick had also sent what George believed to be his boss. In the center of the army walked a green monster that George thought might be based on celery. It stood 7 feet tall, but the strange thing was the creature wore robes and carried a staff. It also had a much more human-looking body. However, it was still green, had leaves for hair, and was whipped thin. George wasn't sure what to think of the odd creature. The first room was cleared quickly. George had left the first 2 rooms exactly the same, hoping to make Rick think he wasn't prepared for his assault. Once the group was fully in the dungeon, George was able to determine that Rick had a full 101 monsters, including the mounts. However, 50 of those were broccoli monsters, which George knew weren't very durable. In a battle of attrition, George should win. The group proceeded down the tunnel to the second room. The lettuce monsters moved to the front as they moved through the tunnel. Rick must have had reason to believe the lettuce monsters could handle George's berry ball. Unfortunately, George found that Rick was right. The lettuce monsters charged into the room with a loud bellow. The pair of berry beasts launched their sneak attacks from the side, but were easily batted away by the much larger monsters. The line of lettuce monsters charged the berry ball, who started rapidly swinging his balls in defensive circles. When one of the balls connected with a lettuce monster, there was a loud series of cracks. The monster let out a howl of pain, but it was the opening the others needed to destroy the berry ball. After George's monster was slain, the boss walked over to the injured lettuce monster. Green light pooled in the boss's hands and flowed into the injured beast. To George's shock, the dent where the ball had impacted began to press back outwards. After only a few moments, the lettuce monster was back to full strength. "He has a healer," George said numbly.
It must have been a magical vegetable he used to create that boss. We haven't encountered any such fruits yet, so I didn't think to bring it up. It's possible, even likely, for bosses to gain natural magical effects. But an ability like that is only gained by evolving a magical vegetable with healing properties, Blue explained.
George hadn't even considered that he could use magical fruits. A couple towns over, he knew a magic pear grew that granted the person who ate it incredible strength. Perhaps George would need to make a trip to gather one of those pears. That was assuming he survived this. The group switched to having the broccoli monsters up front again as they moved to the next tunnel. Things were about to get much more difficult for the army. George felt an immense amount of satisfaction as the leading edge of the army tripped his first trap. It was simple enough, a pit lined with spikes. George was surprised by how effective it was. A full 7 broccoli monsters fell into the pit and died. George hadn't thought about how a group this size would need some time to realize there was a trap and slow down. He was just happy he had installed several of these kinds of traps through the first floor. To cross the trap, the boss ended up creating a bridge of vines over the gap. That made George realize it wasn't healing magic, but plant magic this boss possessed. A secondary benefit of the type of magic was that it could heal these plant-based monsters. This group made it over the bridge relatively quickly and continued down the tunnel. The third room had a different combination of monsters. A pair of berry balls sat on either side of the tunnel's opening. They waited for a few of the broccoli monsters to wander into the room before George gave the order to strike. Heavy balls whipped out into the broccoli monster horde. In the first couple of seconds, 3 of the monsters were down. The army reacted more quickly than George had expected. The group of broccoli monsters split into 2 groups and each sprung at the berry balls. George's monsters were torn apart, but not before 4 more of the broccoli monsters were killed. George was surprised when the boss didn't bother healing the injured broccoli monsters.
"Maybe it has a limit on how much mana it can use,"
Blue offered, having noticed a similar thing. George couldn't think of any other reason it wouldn't heal the beast. The army continued through the first floor, and at every step they bled. A few times they switched the lettuce or mushroom monsters to the front to alleviate the broccoli monsters, but for the most part, George was slaughtering the broccoli beasts. By the time the group reached Paul's room, they were down to a measly 8 broccoli monsters. Yet 5 lettuce monsters, the boss, and all but one of the mushroom monsters were still alive. Paul's room had undergone some changes since the last time Rick's forces were there. Now, instead of a large room with plenty of space, it was rather small, only 6 feet wide, tall, and long. If Paul sat in the exact center of the room, he could reach any point in the room. As a result, when the remaining broccoli monsters charged into it, they were smashed to pieces. All 6 of Paul's appendages found their targets, and a second later, Paul mopped up the remaining monsters. The rest of the army had paused outside of the room where Paul couldn't reach. Honestly, George was not sure how they planned to get past Paul. If they still had all 50 broccoli monsters, they could have sent them all in a wave. It would have been extremely costly, but it would have likely overwhelmed Paul. However, if they tried that now, with just the 10 mounted and 24 mushroom monsters, they likely wouldn't have enough forces to continue to the second floor. The group of monsters shifted, and the boss monster stepped forward. Green light danced in his hands as he entered the room. As he did, all 6 of Paul's limbs swung towards the plant mage. Before the berry balls could strike, the invading mage's ball of green light expanded into a green bubble around the boss. All 6 balls connected and bounced off the bubble. Paul continued to strike the bubble, small cracks forming with each blow. However, George could see the boss performing some kind of magic in the bubble. Before Paul could destroy the glowing shield, the plant mage flung its hands forward. A ball of sickly green energy connected with Paul's main body. Instantly, the bush withered away. His arms fell to the ground limp as Paul died.
Paul, no!
Blue shouted at the demise of their first boss. George understood the sentiment. He could feel the layer of ice that was his internal anger crack at the death of Paul. George had no intention of allowing Rick to defeat him. The invaders stopped and rested in the boss room. George had been surprised by that, but Blue and he figured it must be to allow the boss to regenerate its mana. The pause was a mistake, though. When a sentient being such as a human enters a dungeon, it is prevented from acting in the dungeon due to the being's aura. However, dungeon creatures possess incredibly small auras. As a result, George was able to act almost everywhere in the dungeon. He just couldn't touch the room in which the army was currently located. George absorbed all the bodies from the broccoli monsters, berry beasts, and berry balls in the previous rooms. He was irritated he couldn't reabsorb Paul's body, which could have allowed him to make Rick's invaders fight Paul a second time. However, with the mana he received from the monsters he absorbed, George had enough to create 15 mounted units. Cackling, he summoned these units in a room the army had already cleared, not to attack, not yet, to follow the army, to help tip the balance in a close fight, or to launch a critical attack on the boss. After 5 hours, the menace had his army rise and start up the ramp to the second floor, with lettuce monsters leading the charge, suggesting Rick was nervous about what he might find down there. When they exited the ramp, the group found themselves at an intersection. They could go left or right. This level wasn't exactly finished just yet. Originally, George had wanted 4 groups of tunnels that created a square, and for lack of time he had settled for 3 tunnel squares. If the group went left, it would take them to the interior of the floor, but right would take them around the edge. The greatest part about this floor was the boss room wouldn't reveal itself until every single monster on this floor was destroyed, and there were a lot of monsters on this floor. The Marauders chose to go right along the exterior of the floor. After 30 feet, they turned left, directly into a trap. With a bellow of anger, one of the lettuce lieutenants fell into the pit. In the pit, there were no mere spikes, though. 3 defender units sat at the bottom. When the beast landed, the trap exuded acid, completely coating the lettuce monster. Rick's boss tried to save the creature with its magic, but it was too late. It only took a few seconds for the combined sprays to dissolve the lettuce creature. George let out an evil laugh at the demise of the lettuce monster. There were several of these pits on this level. However, to clear the floor, the Marauders would need to climb down and destroy the blackberry monsters. Unless they accomplished that for every single pit, the boss room would not open. The army didn't know that, so they simply formed a bridge and kept walking. They walked much more slowly now, with mushroom monsters in front. The tunnel they were on now either led straight into another square, or had a left turn towards the interior of the floor. The group paused before the intersection and sent a single mushroom monster around the left-hand turn. After a moment, it returned to the group. They decided to go left. As the group rounded the corner, a group of 6 mounted units came at the group from deeper down the tunnel. The berry beasts had been armed with primitive wooden spears, and they bellowed and waved their spears as they approached the group. The mounted units slammed into the front line of mushroom units. 5 of the 24 mushrooms went down under the large hooves of the water horses. Before the army could retaliate, the mounted units retreated back around the nearest corner. The army pursued the fleeing mounted units, only to be pelted by a rain of apples. To George's disappointment, the apples were not very effective. The front line slammed into the cats a few moments later and got smashed to pieces. After that, the army knew all of George's surprises. Where George had been taking out mushroom monsters in 5s or 6s, with each attack or trap at first, soon he was only managing to eliminate 1 or 2 of the beasts at a time. The progress was slow, but George was managing to whittle away the army's numbers. The issue was the army was also whittling away George's forces. The group had been through each square twice by now. All that remained of George's forces on this floor was the group of 15 who followed them, but who didn't count towards the floor's forces, and another group of 4 mounted units who managed to stay just outside of sight. The dozen defenders were also still alive. The group obviously hadn't figured out that they need to destroy the defenders yet, and George was well aware that trying it would likely cost them a great deal. He was convinced that the boss and the lettuce creatures would be the only ones able to actually destroy one of the defenders, and George had already seen what the acid did to one of the lettuce monsters. George supposed it was time to end the game. His 4 remaining mounted units hadn't been doing any real damage in their hit-and-run tactics the last couple of times. George needed to send them in and make them stay if he wanted to actually deal damage to the army. With a thought, George sent the group in. The berry beasts roared as their mounts charged at the opposing army. Just before the water horses reached the front line of mounted mushroom monsters, the berry beasts leapt from the backs of their mounts. George hadn't expected them to do that, but he wasn't going to complain. It caught the opposing monsters completely by surprise, and spears were able to sink deeply into the bodies of the 4 mushroom monsters. Their riders distracted by being impaled, the carrot mounts were not prepared for the 4 water horses to slam into them, horn first. Mushroom monsters and berry beasts alike went flying off the mounts. Pockets of fighting broke out in the ranks as George's 8 monsters managed to deal significant damage to the group, much more than he had anticipated they could do. He had sent groups of mounted units in like this before, but they had died relatively quickly. "How are they doing that?" George asked. Blue laughed.
"That group of 4 is responsible for half of the mushroom monsters' deaths. It's likely they were close to a natural evolution. If they managed the evolution during this fight, it would be very good for us,"
Blue explained. George watched as the lettuce monsters moved in to smash 2 of the water horses, while 4 of the remaining mounted mushroom monsters directed their mounts to trample the berry beasts. While this was effective, they also trampled 2 of their own in the process. A few moments later, a lettuce monster put the last water horse down. However, that final attack cost the group. They were down to 5 mounted mushroom monsters, 2 walking mushroom monsters, 4 lettuce monsters, and the boss. They had started with 101 monsters and were now down to 11. Not to mention that they still had to clear out the defenders and to face a boss fight, and 15 mounted units were following behind. George was feeling pretty confident that he would win this. He soon learned he shouldn't have been. It didn't take Rick's infantry long to realize they needed to destroy the defender units to enter the boss room. George had expected them to sacrifice the lettuce monsters to make it happen, but instead the boss was able to destroy them, one by one, with magic from above. It took them a while, as the boss needed to rest after each one it destroyed, but still it was a much safer way of destroying the deadly creatures. It took nearly a day for the boss to finish destroying the last of the defenders, rest, and move the remaining troops to the boss room. When they destroyed the last defender, rock slid away on one of the external walls to reveal the boss room. George braced himself for a fight he hoped he would win. The remaining mushroom monsters entered the room first, followed by the lettuce monsters, and finally the boss. They stepped into the room and froze. George could understand why. It was like they had stepped into a small forest. Soft dirt covered the ground to mute any noise. From the dirt, dozens of trees rose to nearly 10 feet in the air. While Rick's denizens were distracted, George's boss peeked from around a rather large tree and flung an apple at the group. Once the apple was away, it quickly ducked back behind the tree. The apple flew with much more accuracy than the cats could manage. Chuck's projectile hammered into one of the carrot mounts. It connected with a leg joint. The joint made a sickening pop before the beast and its rider collapsed. The army stared at the fallen rider and its mount as another pair of red apples thumped into one of the lettuce monsters, connecting with its head. However, it didn't seem to do much damage. The lettuce monster roared and charged into the trees in the general direction of where the apples came from. However, Chuck was much faster than the cats and was already gone. When the lettuce monster was out of the sight of the rest of the group, on George's orders, Chuck slammed another of his apples into the vulnerable vegetable. When the missile hit its target, it disintegrated into several lines of lightning that leaped from the fruit and into the lettuce. The attack was incredibly effective, and it dawned on George that lettuce was made up of mostly water, intensifying the efficacy of electrical attacks. During that attack, the plant mage took the opportunity to raise a green shield around the remainder of the army. Chuck threw red apples at the shield, and they hammered into the surface. The bubble of shield seemed much stronger when Paul fought the mage. Perhaps spreading it over a larger area weakens it. George supposed it wouldn't matter as Chuck was nearly through the barrier. Right before the magical shield fell, the mage flung out its hands, throwing another sickly green ball of energy at Chuck. The mage came surprisingly close to hitting Chuck. Only a last-second dodge behind a tree saved the boss monster. The tree was not quite as fortunate, though. The energy connected, and the tree wilted and died. However, it still stood upright, so Chuck could still use it for cover. That did it. Rick had taken everything from George in life. He was not going to let him go around killing his trees in his dungeon. Time to get serious. I am done having my homes invaded by my nemesis. I deserve a life of peace, and I will fight to get it. George just wanted to grow his plants and live a quiet life. Rick could not be allowed to ruin that. A rain of yellow and blue apples fell onto the remaining army. When the blue apples connected, water shot out of the apple in every direction. It was clearly intended to work with the yellow apples, as the lightning was much more effective with the water present. The remaining mushroom monsters fell quickly. The plant mage had raised a second shield around the 3 remaining lettuce monsters and itself. This shield was much smaller and would likely be able to take more of a beating. The group began moving deeper into the room towards Chuck. George was very concerned by this development. It wouldn't matter if Chuck could kill these 4 or not if they reached George and Blue's position. Chuck would cease to exist if they destroyed George. Lightning apples slammed home into the shield, causing cracks to spiderweb across it. However, each time it was about to collapse, the mage just raised a new shield. George reasoned that those shields were costing it a significant amount of mana, and it wouldn't be able to keep it up indefinitely. However, it might not matter. When the group reached the midpoint of the boss room, George decided he needed to play his final card. He gave the order for his 15 mounted units that had been following the army to attack. The group charged in, spears waving wildly, and slammed into the shield. The boss and lettuce monsters seemed surprised by the onslaught, needing a second to recover from the sudden attack. The moment was enough for George's monsters to destroy the shield and interrupt the mage's attempt at casting another shield. The boss sank to its knees and clutched at its head from the spell feedback. Obviously, it was bad to start and interrupt a spell. Water and lightning apples came flying in, landing on all 3 remaining lettuce monsters. With a loud crackle of energy, all 3 monsters fell to the ground, smoking slightly. A moment later it was over. The remaining mounted units charged the boss and filled it full of horns and spears. A final lightning apple came in and ended the invasion. Relief swept through George. They had done it. They were safe. Relief fled as he felt something enter the dungeon from up above. George was confused as he found it was a single broccoli monster. A line of mana stretched out from the creature and connected with the walls. It traveled swiftly to George's core. When it connected, George heard the malicious voice of Rick. "Congratulations, George, on defeating my vegetable vanguard. It would have been a real shame if I had gathered an entire army together for you to lose to the front forces. Get ready, George. I am coming." George's elation at the victory fell away in a second. More were coming. He needed to get ready. This has been The Fruit Dungeon by Joshua Thomas Foreman, narrated by J. Aldridge. You can find this story and others like it in Tales of Dungeons, Volume 3, published by Jeffrey Falcon Logue and edited by Ellen Dryad Klowden.